One of the complaints you will hear about Set 9 is that legendary units are boring. I don't think this is true at all. They just require a different approach. Take Belveth for example. Once players understood how to itemize her by focusing on attack speed and attack range, her perception changed from being useless to extremely powerful. Today we will tackle another legendary unit, Ahri. I found so many different techniques and interactions that after watching this video you will never see her in the same light again. I hope you're ready, because this unit is broken. Hey, come on, like, look at the kale! Now, this does not make any sense. If we want to optimize Ahri, we have to first understand how she works. Her description states that when she's casting her ability, she will steal the essence from enemies around the current target, dealing magic damage and mana reaving them. Every third cast, she unleashes a wave that deals magic damage to all enemies hit, which is increased by 33% for enemies that got hit by a previous cast. If you activate the Ionia trait, she will also receive 3 mana per second. Now, her ability sounds simple, but in reality it is extremely misleading. A normal player reading this would think that she deals a fairly low amount of damage to her auto attack target, which can spread to adjacent enemies, but this is not the case. In reality, when Ahri is casting her first 2 rotations, she is effectively unleashing a chain lightning. This lightning will always deal 5 instances of damage, and it can spread out to 5 units. But it is possible for a single unit to get hit 5 times as well. The way her spread appears to work is that it checks for enemies in a 2 hex radius from the current location. However, the potential spread range is global. When she kills a unit and there are charges left with no units around, then it can bounce from one side of the board to the other. This brings us to one of our first questions. Do you want AoE or single target damage? Spreading her initial cast will mana reave the enemy frontline, which is usually a good thing. All of the frontliners will also take 33% increased damage from her third cast. For utility purposes, this is great, but it can often leave you with a sour taste in your mouth. Damage spread into the enemy tanks will make her look like she's doing nothing. This brings us to the first tech of this video, the Zephari. The idea is to create a setup that makes Ahri focus her damage in a contained area to kill a unit early into the fight. This also grants you an additional bonus if you're running blue buff, because you will gain an extra 10 mana for a faster rotation. You can accomplish this simply with positioning, but overall it is easier by utilizing Zephyr. The goal is to create a setup that prevents the chain lightning from spreading by removing every valid target in a 2 hex radius. You can either use this in a way to try to nuke the enemy frontline, or simply go completely overboard with Zephyrs and focus on a unit or a small block in the enemy backline. This is the core of Ahri, and if you think this was a cute video showcasing some Zephyr Ahri tech, then you're mistaken. We are just getting started. In most cases, you won't have the luxury of sniping enemy units, and you have to rely on a third cast that covers the entire board. One of the reasons Ahri has such a bad reputation is because her animations are incredibly long, and without any mana items, it can take her almost half the fight before she finally starts to feel useful. Arguably, the most important mechanic for Ahri players to learn is how to reach the third cast faster. There are a ton of different ways to accomplish this, but first we have to talk about the Ionia trait. If you activate this trait, then every Ionia unit will activate their own personal bonus. For example, Ahri receives 3 mana per second. There's also a spirit form that will swap between your Ionian units that grants them 20 mana and doubles the passive bonus for a short amount of time. Both of these mechanics are absolutely crucial for Ahri. You need to have 3 Ionia on your board when playing Ahri. It will heavily increase her casting speed. Since Shen is part of Ionia and he's an invoker, I would also heavily recommend to run at least 2 Invoker on your board for the bonus 5 mana every 3 seconds. This can make a considerable difference, as without the bonus mana from Invoker, you might find yourself in a spot where she requires an additional auto attack because just a tiny amount of mana is missing. So with 3 Ionia and 2 Invokers as our core, what can you as a player do to increase her cast speed even further? Well, obviously we have to talk about items. Ahri should always receive 1 mana item. You can choose between Blue Buff, Shojin, Mana Zane and Invoker Emblem. I would say the best item to reach the 3rd cast early is Mana Zane. It's a very accessible item from augments and there is barely any downtime in between her casts. The only item that can really compete with Mana Zane is the Invoker Emblem. While Mana Zane allows you to remain flexible with your board, the Invoker Emblem will force you into running at least 4 or 6 Invokers, which is a commitment not that many players are willing to make. It can also be very difficult to reach a strong Ahri setup with Invokers, as they often have issues stabilizing in the mid game. Which brings us to the most common items you will see on Ahri: Blue Buff and Shojin. Players will often debate if Shojin or Blue is more efficient on a unit, and in Ahri's case, I believe Blue Buff is the better choice. The overall difference between them is small if you're running 3 Ionia with 2 Invokers, otherwise Shojin Ahri would require an additional attack. Shojin does require the first spirit form to go on Ahri, or she will need 2 attacks for her first cast. Usually the other 2 item slots are reserved for damage, like Rabadon or Jeweled Gauntlet, because there is not much point in Ahri casting faster if she is only tickling her opponents. With the items said, what else can you do to influence the fight? Well, it turns out that there are 2 regions in set 9 that we can use to our advantage: the Ionian region, God-Willow's Grove, and the Shuriman region, Shifting Sands. God-Willow's Grove gives you a field on the most right spot on your bench, where you can place units to activate their traits. This is quite relevant for Ionia because it allows for a unique strategy to force her spirit form twice in a row. What you want to do is to place Shen on the hex on your bench and the other Ionian unit, which is usually Karma, in the front row as a sacrificial pawn. As long as your sacrificed unit dies within the first 4 seconds of the fight, every single spirit form is now guaranteed to go onto Ahri for bonus mana. It does have the downside of keeping your Shen on the bench and sacrificing one of your units early into the fight, but if your Ahri is strong enough and you have a good replacement tank, then this can be well worth it. Something I should mention about the God-Willow region is that Ionia is not always that big of a fan if you activate the trait with the help of the bench. It is possible that you have an Ahri 2-star with 3 items and the first spirit will get prioritized on the unit in the front line. This doesn't always happen. It probably has something to do with a weird tiebreaker rule, but it's not that big of a deal. For starters, if you have Blue on Ahri, this doesn't make any difference since she starts with full mana anyways, and also the tiebreaker rules for everything that involves a strongest unit will change in a future patch anyways. The next region we want to visit is the Shifting Sands. Not the most popular region, but it allows for some very fancy strategies. This region will grant you a magnetic remover every round. This allows us to remove Ahri's items every round. Now there are a few reasons why this can make sense. First up, we can force the first spirit form to be prioritized on our Shen in the front line. We only return 2 items to Ahri and wait with the 3rd item until combat starts. If you're running Blue Buff, you can cheese out a faster second cast, which can be useful if your goal is to focus down units early into the fight. You can also use a similar strategy by combining Blue Buff with Archangel. You can leave Archangel on Ahri to make sure that you receive all of the AP stacks, but you keep the Blue Buff on your item bench. The Ionia spirit form grants 20 mana at the start of the fight, so in combination with the 30 mana from Archangel, she will start the fight with full mana. Once she's done with her first cast, you can give her the Blue Buff, which puts her at full mana again, and you cheese out a second cast right away. Since the region grants you a remover every round, you can repeat this as much as you want. The last strategy I want to talk about is a bit controversial. It works great in the Shifting Sand regions as well, but this time it's not required. Instead, what you will need is an Ionian Emblem. Since Blue Buff Ahri starts with full mana, her first spirit form is usually wasted on her. If you have an Ionian Emblem on your item bench, you can time the item to activate the trait to give you the bonus mana for the second cast. Next round, you can either use the magnetic remover on the emblem, or you just run a filler unit that you keep selling every single round to repeat the process. Now, unfortunately, I ended up discovering that this strategy results in a bug that can unintentionally spawn a second spirit form. Since this is only possible by intentionally delaying an emblem, I believe this falls under the exploit category for Riot and therefore might be punished. I would advise you to not utilize this emblem strategy at the moment, as it might endanger your account, and instead you should just wait for Riot to fix this interaction. Quite frankly, I could talk about Ahri all day long, but this video is getting too long for my taste. I'm certain that the player base will discover even more techs in the future, and I for one can't wait to try them out. I hope you learned something, and see you next time.